Let's take a look at the SQL constraint defaults. Defaults is used to display a specified value when the insert into statement does not provide a value. So let's say, for instance, we are computing or we're gathering data of voters within our city or within our state, and we want some of our columns to have default values. How do we add that when we create the schema for our table? Okay, so I'm just going to make a comment here and say creating, or let's say add in a default constraint. Okay, so what we'll be doing is to create a table, a voters registration table, which is supposed to capture information about our voters. So we'll do create table. We'll call the table voters registration. And what are the values we would like to collect? We need the name. That will be varchar. We'll make that 50. So that's the name of our voters. And we'll like to have the ages of our voters as well. So that'll be an integer. Now let's assume we want to capture the employment status of our voters. And would have the voters, we have the option of either saying they're employed or unemployed. But perhaps we want to give room for those that maybe are in between jobs, or some people might just prefer not to give out that information. But when we look at our table, we don't want to see null values. So we want something to be printed out for those that did not enter any information. So we can add the default value. So, and this is how we do that. So let's say we have our employment status, and this would be a varchar, and we'll make that 50. And this is where we now pass in the default constraint. And all we need to do is just type default. And what's the default value that we need to print out? And we'll just say unknown, because we don't know what the status of the voter is, since they didn't enter that information. We just wanted to print out unknown. So let's say we also want to capture information about let's say the city, and that will be varchar. We'll make that 50. And then lastly, we'll like to capture information of the state. But because we're collecting voters information in a particular state and we know that information, we don't want the voters to manually enter that information. So we can add a default value again to say, to specify or to print out the state in which we're collecting those data. So we'll say state, and we have varchar. I'll make that 50. And then we say default value would be, and let's just say that's a New York. That's a New York. Okay. Now okay. So just to quickly run through this again, we're creating a voters table. We have the name, we have age, we want the employment status, and that will be whether employed or unemployed. We want them to enter the city they're voting, where they're voting, and then the state, we want a default value of New York to be printed out. So let's go ahead and execute this. And if we just select, just to see what our table looks like from voters registration. So right now we just have we have all the columns. We have the name, age, employment status, city, and state. Then insert some records into our voters registration table. So we go insert into voters registration. What values would we want to insert? We want the name of our voters. I like to have their age. From now, we'll just keep the employment status because we want to see how the default constraint works. And then we'll have city, and we'll skip over state as well. Let's include the values. And what do we want the name to be? Let's say Sunday Maxwell. And then the age, let's say 29, 28. And city, super clean. And then we can go ahead and insert this record. Execute. Just gonna copy this record and make some changes. Let's say this is and Ginseng. And let's say Punam is the 1 and Punam is from New York. Okay, and let's go ahead and insert this record. All right, so now let's print out our table. So what we'll see is that now we have our first record, Sandy Maxwell, age 28, and the employment status says unknown, and that's because we did not enter any value, and unknown is the default value we chose. And we have the cities, Brooklyn and New York, and the same thing with Punam, we have an unknown status. Now let's go ahead and add more record, and this time, copy this again. This time we want to include the employment status. It's employment status. And we'd like to include as well the state. So let's change the name. Let's say Frank Loggy. And Frank is 25. And let's say Danny. And now we want an employment status and would say employed and the state. Now, just to show you that we can always override, because the way default works is that when a value is not entered, then that default value becomes the value. But when a value is entered, so in the situation where we have state, if for instance, let's say I choose, let's say Washington. Okay. All right, so let's do that. And just gonna run this, execute, and let's enter another value. And let's say this time around, what do we want? Okay, let's just change the name first. Okay, now I'm just making up words, making up names. Ferry, and let's say PM is from, just say Uptown, I don't know, Uptown, New York. And Kim is unemployed. And we'll just leave the state out. Okay. All right, and we can run this as well. Okay, there are more FT because, so now it's saying because we have this, the state was included here, I have to put in a value. Okay, so let's just say, you know what, let's say, let's just say New York. Let's just say New York. Okay. Okay, and then we can insert this. So now when we select our table, so we see that for Frank Logie, we have employed because we added that value. We have unemployed for Kim because we entered that value as well. We have the cities showing up as Albany and Uptown New York. And then we have Washington. So even though we did set a default value for our state because we entered a different value, then that gets printed.